Hello, and welcome to our fifth demo. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about advanced JavaScript, where you get into Node a little bit about how information is passed in Node, how to create our own servers. But first, we really have to understand the way that JavaScript will process and execute commands, and in which order that they execute. So I'm going to start off this demo by very quickly talking about the different types of ways that JavaScript, or we can declare variables in JavaScript. So we're running locally on port 5000. You notice that here we have our default page. I'm going to get back to this in 1 second. But for the most part, in the first part of this demo, I want to create a file called advanced.javascript. So I want to talk about some advanced features of JavaScript. And there's really only two things that we have to understand here, and that is the first one being the JavaScript variable scope. Okay, so generally speaking, JavaScript has three variable scopes. There's the global scope, there is a function scope, and there is a block scope. All right, so let's start off by giving a pretty quick example. I'm going to have a variable. Actually, let's create a function first of all. So I'm going to create a function called myfunc. And in here, I'm just going to declare a few variables. I'm going to use the word var, the one that we've been using so far. And var is what we call a function scope. So function scope is the declaration with the var. So let's just call this v. Okay. So var, I'm going to make it equal to my func scope. Right. So I have this string. All right. There is another variable called let. And I'm going to call this LE, and this is the myfunc let. Let's call this var, my let var. All right, so you understand myfunc var. So I hope you understand what I'm trying to do here. So I've declared two variables. Let, in short, is called the block scope. All right, so if we do console.log here 2 times, or one for v and the other for le, this will work because in short, this is the scope of this function, myfunc, and it's also in this block, right? It's also in this block, in the scope of this block. Now, on the other hand, if I did something like, let's do a for loop. Okay, so for, we're going to say var I equal to 0, I is less than, let's say, 10, and I plus plus, and this is now in the scope of this for loop. I'm going to do a console.log of I. All right, so after this, I'm going to do a console.log and then I. All right, so I'm going to see how this works because I've declared this var inside of this for loop, and I just want to figure out whether or not this I actually still exists. All right, so before we do that, I'm going to jump over to my form and I'm going to link up this script. All right, so my source is going to be equal to advanced.js. So let's jump over to my form. .html, and I'm just going to inspect it, bring up the console, and I'm going to call myfunc. I'm going to call this function myfunc. All right, so it prints out. So let's go back to the advanced.js file. All right, so it prints out the myfunc var. It prints out myfunc let, and then from 0 all the way up to 10, it prints it out. Now, notice that what happened, and just ignore this undefined. The undefined is as a result of finishing the function. But when we finished the for loop, I should be equal to 9. Sorry, the last printout should be equal to 9, but then when the function ends, I should be equal to 10. So this console.log I is actually printing out 10. So this I actually exists at this point because the I was declared within this function scope, right? So within the scope of my function. Now, on the other hand, let's use the let. Okay, so let I equal 0, and then I'll do exactly the same thing. And now I'm going to run this again, and I'm going to call on my func. Oops. And you see, after 9, after it goes through this for loop, you see the I exists within the scope, but then after it exits, the I no longer exists. So when we try to do the console.log I, it says it doesn't exist anymore. Okay, so now I hope you can see the difference between the two things. All right, I'm going to show you one last thing here. I'm going to do a myfunc, call this function. So I'm going to basically print out everything. I'm just going to comment this out so that doesn't give me an error. And I'm going to try to print out, so console.log, I'm going to try to print out v. Okay, so the thing I want you to note here is that v is now outside the scope of my func. So let's see if it actually prints it out. So I'm going to do a refresh here. So it prints out, so when I call this function, it does print out v and le, and it does go through that for loop, but as soon as it tries to do the console.log v, it is not defined. So because it is outside the scope of my func. So again, variable scope, function scope is var, block scope is let. So even if I wanted to print out LE here, it would give me the exact same error because LE is even tighter. It's just within a particular block of code. Okay, now if I took this away, so I did not declare var v, right? Instead, I did v. That is what we call a global scope. So v is declared on a global level. So now if I do console.log v, it should exist. So let's go back here, and I'm going to run this one more time. And you see, it does print out my var because my var was now declared on a global level. So now on a global level, meaning that it's not constrained by any function, it is on a global scope. All right, so I hope you can see the difference between each one of these variables. It does make a difference, especially when we get into deeper and deeper programming in Node, because we're essentially using the same syntax in Node as we are in JavaScript. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Let me comment this out. And now we need to talk about the second thing to fully understand how JavaScript works. Now, JavaScript is the advantage of JavaScript is that it is typically understood as an asynchronous language. And basically what that means is if you understand this in terms of a server, the traditional types of servers that we have basically respond to requests in this way. So, so let's pretend we have a server. Okay, so there's a server, and the server always is actively listening for requests. So let's say that we have a client 1, and client 1 is giving a request over to the server. There is a thread that will take that request. Okay, so let's say this request involves some sort of processing. This is going to call on another thread. So let's just take the traditional example of calling a database. So it's going to, in order to satisfy this request, it's going to have to call on a database. So in the database is currently running a thread to kind of calculate all of this data and eventually to be able to send it back to the thread that is handling this request. And then of course that is going to send back a response to client 1 so that they can display it on the browser. But what if at the same time there's another client, client 2, that sends in another request? Then there's going to be another thread that handles that request. And right now, it can't access the database because the database is blocked. So any attempt that this thread is going to make on this database is going to be blocked. So until this database finishes the calculation, it's going to send back the results to this thread. Then it's open to receive more requests. Now, what the problem is that this, in the meantime, while we're waiting for this database to process this data, this thread is just sitting there and it's doing nothing. Okay, so it's actually wasted resource that is sitting there. So you can imagine if we had like many clients, right? And they're all waiting for the database. All of these threads would be sitting here and doing nothing, right? So essentially we're wasting a lot of the resources within our system. And it results in a little bit more of an inefficient execution. Now, of course, if you're running a real world server, this process actually is not that long. It doesn't really take that long, but nonetheless, there are still these things that are sitting here that are waiting for their time to execute something. All right, so that's a little bit of background. Oh, sorry. So how does JavaScript or Node, how would it rectify this situation? So Node is a single thread program. So basically what happens is there is a thread that takes this response. Now, what's going to happen is it's going to head over to the database and it's going to drop off that request. Now, at the same time, it would go back out to here and look for other things that it would need to do. So at the same time, it would then say, oh, okay, request number 2 is also coming in, and it also needs to access the database. It's going to take note of that. It's going to put that onto a queue, and it's going to, at the same time, asynchronously look for other work as well. So you have this thing called an event loop that basically keeps going around, collecting more and more work and putting it into its corresponding containers that is going to wait for its turn for execution. So I hope you understand what that means. I'm going to show you this in a very quick example. Now, this is basically just to simulate what is happening on the server side, but it's very important to understand this point because eventually when we get into node programming, we have to know that this is happening in the background. All right, so let me just erase all of these drawings and just do our next example here. All right, so let's pretend that I have two functions. I'm gonna call it CB1, which is a function, and this function, I'm just going to have a console.log, and then I'm just going to call it CB1. Okay, so I'm going to output CB1. Var CB2 is another function, console.log, and then I'm going to print out CB2. So this is just to note that this is the result of these callbacks, and call it callback 1 and callback 2. All right, so then I'm just going to have JavaScript console.log start ... and then I'm going to call this set timeout function. All right, so before I go on further, I just want to show you how this set timeout function works. If I call set timeout, it's going to have two parameters. The first parameter is a callback function. Shoot, maybe I should, yeah, this was something I typed in earlier. So the first one is a callback function, okay? So callback is basically what I'm gonna do when I'm done this, when the timeout is done. The second parameter is the number of milliseconds. Okay, so the number of milliseconds here that I'm defining is 3,000, which corresponds to 3 seconds. So basically what I'm doing in this command is after 3 seconds, I want you to invoke this command. Okay, this is our callback. Okay, so you can see that what happens is after 3 seconds, we're going to console.log done. Okay, so after 3 seconds, now don't worry about this one. This is just the ID of the set timeout. Okay, so basically what we're doing is taking 3 seconds off and then we're doing this. Now, this 3 seconds you could imagine as, the database processing, or something is processing something that we're waiting for this command. So in the meantime, you can understand what's happening is JavaScript is picking up something else to do. It's not just waiting for these 3 seconds, because in the meantime, there might be other processes to run. There might be other things to do. And it's not until after those 3 seconds that this function gets invoked. All right, so let's translate this to our example. I'm going to put cv1 as our second parameter here. I'm going to say one second. Okay, so I'm going to wait 1 second, and I'm going to invoke cv1. Similarly, I'm going to call another set timeout, and I'm going to make this cv2, but I'm going to make this half a second, so 500 milliseconds. And then I'm going to console.log end. Okay, so now if you're just reading this code, and if this was like a traditional programming language, you might expect that what's happening is that I'm going to console.log the word start, and then I'm going to make the system wait for a minute. And then I'm going to log cb1. Then I'm going to make it wait for another half second. Sorry, 1 second. And then I'm going to make it wait for a half second. And I'm going to log cb2. And then I'm going to print out end. So logically, that might make sense to us. But that's not how JavaScript works, because it's an asynchronous language. So, so while other languages may block everything else from happening while this command is being executed, JavaScript doesn't do that. It runs it, and then it waits. It makes it wait, and then it goes out and tries to find other things to do. Okay, so let's run this and see what happens. So I'm just going to do a refresh on this. Okay, so now see what happens. I know that happened pretty quickly. You can go back and take a look exactly what happened. Start, end, and then CV2 printed out, and then CV1 printed out. All right, so what exactly is happening here? You probably could have guessed already what's happening exactly here, but let's just go through step by step what's going on. So the first step here is that we have this thing called a call stack. Okay, so it's an execution stack. So this is called a call stack. And a call stack is essentially telling JavaScript what to execute. So the first thing, I'm going to call this, instruction number 1. So what happens is instruction number 1 gets put onto the call stack. Okay, this says console.log and then start. Well, this one doesn't have a callback, so we just execute it, and so this is the result of the first the first instruction. All right, so after this gets taken away, and so we're ready for the second instruction. Second instruction is a set timeout. Okay, so set timeout is going to be put on the call stack, and set timeout does have a callback associated with it. So what happens is during this execution, it's going to say, oh, okay, I'm going to process something for a second. So it's going to call on this thing called a web API, and it's going to say, okay, keep track of this callback one, the CV1 function, because later I'm going to need it. Okay, and at the same time, it's done execution of set timeout. Okay, so it's going to pass on the responsibility to something else, as you can think of it as running in the background. All right, so now this disappears as well, and it's ready for the next instruction. Next instruction is another set timeout. So number 3 gets put on the call stack, and same thing. It's going to invoke this web API, and it's going to say take note of CB2 because later I might need it. And then we're done with instruction number 3. All right, after that, we have the execution of instruction number 4. Now notice that you should keep in mind that this is still within our 1 second or half second window. So we're still executing things from here, and right now number 4 is going to execute. So this gets printed out. See, end gets printed out, and at this point, we would have done all of the commands on this global level, and so now we're waiting. After half a second, the set timeout instruction would have completed, and now it's time to put CB2 back on the call stack. And the first thing it does is it puts this onto a queue, which says, I'm now waiting for CB2 to execute. CB2 is now ready to be executed. It's a callback that's ready to be put on the call stack. And this event loop, remember our event loop, our thread that keeps going around collecting things to do, our event loop is going to realize that the call stack is empty. So it's going to pick up CB2 and it's going to put it on the call stack. And now it's going to execute CB2. Half a second later, well, actually, it's going to execute and then CB2 will be removed from the call stack, right? Half a second later, same thing happens to CB1, right? So CB1 also gets put on the queue and eventually get put on the call stack. All right, so this is essentially what happens for the execution of JavaScript. Okay, so Node, as we get into Node later on, you should note that it uses the same style. Okay, so it uses the same execution process. It has an event loop that keeps going around, collecting new work to do, and keeps putting it onto the call stack. So when we write Node, we essentially start writing functions that are embedded into other functions. As an example, if I need a variable that I'm like for CB2, if I need a variable, I better make sure that anything that gets executed before that is going to set that variable, right? So I need to keep that in the back of my mind as I do programming in JavaScript. And we are going to make these mistakes as we go on. Even really seasoned JavaScript programmers are going to make these mistakes, not knowing, the order of execution of a program in JavaScript. Okay, so now I think we're ready to jump over to look at programs in Node.js. So let's jump over to this index.js. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do in index.js is I'm going to make it read a little bit better. Right now, I know that some of you understand this notation, but for me, I don't really like this notation. I'm going to make a var app is equal to express. Now, calling this express function is going to create an application for me. It's going to create a server for me. And I'm going to replace all of these with app.use and app.set and app.set and app.get and all of this. Okay, for me, this reads a little bit better because this is basically invoking the functions associated with this object. Okay, now you don't have to do that. I really have not changed the meaning of this program. I will also put semicolons just because I'm used to reading semicolons. Once again, you don't need that. JavaScript doesn't require semicolons at the end, but I just like to put them there just so that it reads better for me. All right, so let's take a look at each line of these codes. This application that I'm running, this server that I'm running, is going to use a static file in public. Okay, so in the public folder, now notice, so far I've told you don't mess with this server. All you need to do is add files into the public folder. Okay, so for the assignment one, that's really all you need to do. You don't need to mess with the server, just mess with the public folder. That's all you need to do, okay? Because everything that we're doing so far is as a result of a static file. All right, but we're gonna go a little bit further here. We're gonna talk about Node and how that works. So, so the next thing we wanna do is get into the views. So the views folder is going to contain all of the views. I'll talk about what those are in a second. The view engine that we're going to use is EJS, which stands for Embedded JavaScript. If you take a look at these pages, this is db.ejs, index.ejs. This is essentially adding more functionality to our server so that it now understands embedded JavaScript. I'll show you an example of embedded JavaScript in 1 second, but let's move on to the next line. App.get, we're going to have a lot of these statements, okay? And essentially what this means is whenever we are sending a get request, when the client sends a get request over to the server, they will also have a path associated with that. In the root directory, I want you to render, so there's a request object and a response object. I want you to respond by rendering pages index. Now, if you take a look at pages index, it's referring to this thing right here. And what you're looking at here is essentially the default page for Heroku. This was given to us when we downloaded or when we cloned the project, the sample project. All right, so when we were running this application on localhost 5000, and we're seeing the default page. Let me bring up a new one here. So when we were doing a default page, localhost 5000, so this is basically the response that you're getting from pages index. Okay, now we're going to do another one just in 1 second here, just to show you what EJS looks like. But the last line here is we are doing a app.listen, so the port that we're listening on, so the port that we've defined it is either in the environment variable. So if we're in production, we're going to see an environment variable. If we're not in production, if our application is not sitting on Heroku, it is sitting locally, we're running it on port 5000. So this is basically what this line is doing. So right now you see I'm running it on port 5000, and I'm listening on and then writing the port. So essentially, this is what we're seeing in this output here. Okay, now let's add a few more functionalities to our server. So app.get, and I'm going to provide first a route. So when I do something like data, okay, so let's call it database. All right. So you see, when we access the root of the application, we actually don't have anything that comes after localhost 5000, right? So right now, let's say that I have some function associated with our request and response, and I have a function that is going to define what I'm going to do if I get a request that is database. Okay, all right. So let me just type in some code here. I'm going to make a var, and then I'm going to say results. All right. Now results, I'm going to pass this in to my render function. I'll show you how this works in 1 second. But there's going to be actually, let's call this something else. Let's call this data. Okay, so let's pretend that we call it database, and we get in response some data. Now, I'll talk about databases in the next demo. And there's going to be a results, and then let's say results is an array 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right. So I hope you remember this notation from our discussion on objects last time. I'm basically creating an object that has the parameter called results, and that value is this array here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do a response.render. You see, same thing that we're doing here. And I'm going to render pages slash and db. So that means I'm going to render this page, and I'm going to send in my data. Okay, so response.render the pages, and I'm going to send in that data. So now, presumably, this data object is going to exist now in this file. All right, so let me jump over to this file and take a look at what it's doing. Now, if you've gone through the Heroku tutorial, you would have connected a database as well. So here, I'm just going to simplify things a little bit. I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to get rid of ID, and I'm just going to print out R. Okay, so results is referring to this results. So for everything in results, so 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, I just want to print out the R. Now, I just want you to take note here that this less than % in an EJS file inside says I'm referring to JavaScript. So I want to write some JavaScript in here. this less than sign with the percent and an equals is talking about just print it out. So you can imagine that this is really just print the R. Okay, so this equal sign, read it as print, and then whatever that's in there. Okay, so what we're doing here is essentially printing all the R's in the form of LIs, list items. Now here, you are also including partials and the header as well as the navigation. And this is just by default for Heroku. You can get rid of these if you don't like them there, okay? But I'll show you where they come from in a second. All right, so I'm gonna save this file. So now what I've just done is added some functionality. So right now I haven't reloaded the server yet. If I just type in localhost 5000 and I type in database, you notice that it says I cannot get database. I cannot get this because I haven't added that functionality in yet. So after saving this, I will also need to restart this server. So I'm going to do Control C. I'm going to terminate this server and I'm going to run this server again. Now, of course, there's a faster way to do this, which I'll get into a little bit later on. But right now, see, now it's listening on port 5000. I'm going to come back to this right here. I'm going to refresh. And now you see it's printing out database results. So let me go to database. Okay, so it's printing out database results, and then it's printing out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? In the form of the list items. Now, what you're looking at up here is basically the navigation as well as the headers. Okay, so the headers as well as the navigation is what we're printing out here. Sorry, this is just the navigation. The headers was actually included in the metadata of this file. Okay, so that's a little bit about how EJS works, and essentially in our applications, we just need to keep adding a lot of this functionality. Okay, so that's basically what we're doing in assignment 2, which hasn't been posted yet, but assignment 2, that's basically what we'll be doing. Now, you might be wondering about this get and post. Okay, so I will talk a little bit about get and post in the setup for this demo, but essentially a get is whatever we type into our browser, right? So when we type in localhost and then /database, we're sending a get operation. But there's also other operations that we can do as well, which is called a post operation. Now, I'm going to jump back to this myform.html. You see this method is called post. So what I'm doing here is if I'm sending some data from my client over to the server, I want to send the method of post along with it. And what that means is that I'm going to make some alterations to the server side. So either I'm adding some data there or I'm altering the database in some way. That's basically what post is referring to. Now, the action, I'm actually going to fill this in for myform.html is going to be a slash, and then I'm going to type in, let's see, what should we do here? We're doing username and age. So let's just call it add user. Okay, so you probably would have guessed that add user is corresponding to, to this thing here. Okay, so this is basically our path for the server. Okay, so here I'm going to just add this functionality here. Do app.post, and then so you see instead of app.get, I'm going to do app.post, and then I'm going to do add user. All right, so again, we have a request and response object. I'm going to give it some functionality. So in this function, I'm going to give it some functionality. So when I see a post request and going to add user, what am I going to do? All right, so for now, let me just do a console.log and then post request for add user. All right, So this is just a placeholder, and I'm going to put some functionality here in a second. All right, so once again, let's go through that whole process. I have the myform.html. There is a button associated with this submission. Let's see here. In fact, I don't want to call it a button. I want to rewrite this. I'm going to call it ID still a button, but I'm going to do an input. Let's do input here. All right, so this is a submit input. And then the name of this input is going to be sub, okay? And the value of this input is going to be send to server. All right, so you're going to see in a second how this is going to look. When I hit the submit button, I'm going to send the action over to add user. The reason why button doesn't work here is because it's specifically looking for an input type submit. All right, so now it's going to send it over here, and hopefully this is going to get printed out as a result. So let's see if it does do that. I'm going to go back here. I'm going to restart my server, and let's see here. Heroku local, and now it's listening on port 5000. And now I'm going to come over here, and instead of database, I'm going to go to my form.html. Now, the difference between this, like when I type myform.html, really what's happening is the server is going into our public folder, and it's going to try to find myform.html. Just like when I typed database earlier, it was going into the public folder and looking for database. There's no file called database, so it resorts to running the rest of the code. Okay, so here, my form does exist, so it's actually going to give me this file. Okay, so myform.html, and it's going to give me this. It's going to send, there's a button here called send to server, and then also another add button. So I'm just going to type in something here. I'm going to send to server, and right now you see it moving, okay? Because it's waiting for a response. Notice in the code, I don't provide a response. So it just keeps going. And eventually this, this request is going to time out, okay? But I'm going to jump over to our console, and you see here, it printed out post request for add user. So basically what you're seeing is that it has actually taken that request and it's actually executed this code, okay? So it's working properly, even though right now you see this this thing keep going around. I'm going to stop this for now. Okay, so the server is in fact working. It is actually you know, executing this code. So let me fix this part for 1 second here. Instead of send to server, I'm just going to say server, and I'm going to do another BR tag here. Okay, just so it looks a little bit better. To add the functionality of working with these variables, this uname, age, we need to kind of tell it where to look for it on the server. So imagine the scenario here where we click on this button. So we put a value. So we put our name and our age onto the form, and we click this submit button. It's going to travel over, and it's going to be received by this function, right? So you see, it invoked this function when I clicked on the submit button. So so what I'm going to do here is actually give it a little bit more functionality, and let's see, maybe I just do a response dot send. Okay, now this is just another function. So I'm sending a response, and I'm just going to send two variables. Okay, so var uname. Okay, I'm going to make this as the request. Now, request is this object right here. Okay, so in the request, in the body of the request, there should be a variable named uname. All right, so let's just break this down. In the request, in the body, there's a uname variable. So when I send over this form, in the request, In the body of that request, there should be a uname variable. Okay, same thing with age. So I'm going to attach age as well. So var age is equal to the request dot body dot age. All right. So so next, I'm just gonna kind of regurgitate that. Okay, so so this is the backwards. Um, I don't know what it's called. These backticks. It's right under the tilde symbol on top of your tab on your keyboard. All right, so this is indicating a string that I can just plug variables in there. So I'm just going to type in username, and then the money sign as well as this open and close squiggly bracket, we can put in a variable right inside. So username is this, and then age is this. Okay, so this is the variable associated with age. This is uname that is associated with that one. All right, so I'm going to send this response, and this is basically what's going to be printed onto the page. Now, before I run the server again, I need to essentially tell it to work with JSON. Okay, so so the body that's coming in, it is actually a JSON object that has come in. So in Express, there is the functionality for understanding JSON. So we have to write this line. So express JSON. So this essentially gives the server the ability to work with JSON. We also need another one, app.use. If you can't remember this, just remember you basically need these two lines for every server that you write for Node. So express.url encoded, and for that we need extended false. Actually, don't remember what this is for, but this has always worked for me. So so I'm going to just leave it like that. So in these two lines, we're basically saying that I need to understand the URL. I need to encode the URL so that I can work with it in the server. I need the server to understand JSON as well. Okay, so that's exactly how we're pulling these values from the body. All right, so if I haven't made any mistakes, if I do add user, if I do a post command to add user, it should display those two things. Okay, so let's run our server again. And I'm just going to do Heroku local. And it's listening on port 5000. And I'm going to refresh my form. So remember, I made some changes to it. It looks like this now. And I'm going to type in username, BC, and age 33. And then I'm just going to do server, press server. All right, so you notice it sends it over to this function here, and it's printing out the username BC and then age 33. So it just sends it as that. Of course, you see it's not formatted at all. This is not proper HTML. If we wanted to render as proper HTML, we would use the render function. But here I'm just sending some results back, and it is displaying it on the browser, but it's not in proper HTML form. Okay, so if I wanted to display in an HTML form, what I need to do is actually create an object much like this, and then send it to a render function that's in Pages. Okay, I hope you got all that. You might have to kind of go back and take a look at this demo a little bit closer to kind of get all the details. All right, so one last thing I want to show you, but before I do that, I want to come back and just stop this server. So there is a, oh, okay, I'm not sure why it's giving me this. All right, so let's, all right, so I'm gonna go back to my Node demo and Comp276 demo. And now I'm going to install something, because you notice that every change that I make, I had to reinstall the server, like rerun the server by invoking Heroku Local. But now what I want to do is actually be able to run this server, but not have to go through that every single time. So this is just good, you know, debugging, a good way to debug. But at the same time, it kind of shifts our workflow a little bit. I'll show you what I mean. So there is this thing called NodeMon. Install, and then this -G is talking about globally. So I want to install this global. So as a result, you see that we've installed NodeMon, and it's here. My npm is a little bit out of date, so I need to kind of upgrade it. But when I'm in this directory, I can invoke NodeMon and index.js. Now, what this does is it runs index.js, right? And you see, it still gives me this listening on port 5000. So right now, the server is in fact running, right? So, so if I do, well, let's go back and take a look at this form, right? So if I do copy and page, server, it does send me that, right? Okay, but what this NodeMon actually does is that when we alter this code for the server, we no longer have to go back and restart the server. It's automatically going to restart it for us. So let me just show you the last thing I want to show you here, and you'll see that it actually does that. So I'm going to do a final app.get. Now, one way that we can identify our paths is that we can identify the IDs that go with the paths. So what I mean by this is, let's say I have a get function, and this get function is to users slash, and then I'm going to give this colon an ID. Now this ID is now an identifier. It's just a variable. It's an identifier for that page. So, so for example, I might have a request and response here, again, just like always, and I'm going to give it some functionality, but this time I'm going to do console.log, and then I'm just going to show you the request dot, now this is called params, okay? So in the request, there's going to be a parameter called ID. Now, if this was named something else, this would be here. Okay, so in the parameters, I just want to log the ID, and just so that I don't get the, you know, I don't get the spinning circle, I'm just going to send, got it, something like that. Okay, so now you notice that I saved. So I want you to see what happens. So when I saved, it automatically restarted due to changes. So it kind of was able to take the server and say, oh, the server changed some of its, you know, response, the functionalities. So I'm going to restart it, and now it's listening on port 5000 again. Okay, let's jump over to our server, and this time I'm going to do users, and then I'm going to type in something. So let's say 12. Okay, it says got it, but you notice that it logged 12, right? It logged the ID 12. So what good is this? Okay, so the typical way that we would go through and access some database data would be that, you know, we can have users slash 12, and this is talking about that I want to access some data of the user 12. So maybe what I would do here is I would take this as a variable, right? So I would take var the user ID, right? This is maybe the user ID that I'm referring to is equal to this requirements, or sorry, requirements, request dot params dot ID. And now I'm going to search the database using the UID. Now, of course, I haven't really talked about the database yet, but you can see what the usefulness of this would be. Okay, now again, I saved the server. You'll see that if we go back to the command prompt, it restarted. Okay, so NodeMon does this for me. Okay, the problem with running NodeMon at this point is that when we were running Heroku local, it actually does some background processing. So we do lose some of that. So, so as we get further and further, I'll drop a few more hints as to what Heroku is actually doing in the background. But I think if we're just, changing the functionalities of our server a little bit at a time, this is a really nice tool to use. Okay, so so I'm going to stop it here for this demo. And next week, what we're going to do is jump into, I really haven't decided yet. I'll either jump into Git and talk a little bit about Git and version control, or I will jump into database, or even both. We'll see how time goes for next week. But basically, the stuff that we're talking about in this demo is used in assignment 2 as well as your projects. Okay, so I will stop this demo for now. Thank you for watching. I will see you guys next week.